Buddha on ignorance, the darkness that rules you. Ignorance, the Buddha said, is the ultimate cause of stress and suffering. By ignorance, he meant not a general ignorance of the way things are, what we usually call delusion or moha, but something more specific, ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. And the Pali word he chose for ignorance, avijjā, is the opposite of vijja, which means not only knowledge, but also skill, as in the skills of a doctor or animal trainer. So in stating that people suffer from not knowing the Four Noble Truths, he wasn't just saying that they lack information or direct knowledge of those truths. He was also saying that they lack skill in handling them. They suffer because they don't know what they're doing. The Four Truths are 1. Stress, which covers everything from the slightest tension to out-and-out agony. 2. The cause of stress. 3. The cessation of stress. And 4. The path of practice leading to the cessation of stress. When the Buddha first taught these truths, he also taught that his full awakening came from knowing them on 3 levels: identifying them, knowing the skill appropriate to each, and knowing finally that he had fully mastered the skills. The Buddha identified these truths in precise, fairly technical terms. When identifying stress, he started with examples like birth, aging, illness and death, sorrow, distress, and despair. Then he summarized all varieties of stress under 5 categories, which he called 5 clinging aggregates, clinging to physical form, to feelings of pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain, to perceptions or mental labels, to thought constructs, and to sensory consciousness. The cause of stress he identified as 3 kinds of craving: craving for sensuality, craving to take on an identity in a world of experience, and craving for one's identity and world of experience to be destroyed. The cessation of stress he identified as renunciation of and release from those 3 kinds of craving. And the path to the cessation of stress he identified as right concentration together with its supporting factors in the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right mindfulness. These 4 truths are not simply facts about stress. They are categories for framing your experience so that you can diagnose and cure the problem of stress. Instead of looking at experience in terms of self or other, for instance, or in terms of what you like and dislike, you look at it in terms of where there's stress, what's causing it, and how to put an end to the cause. Once you can divide the territory of experience in this way, you realize that each of these categories is an activity. The word stress may be a noun, but the experience of stress is shaped by your intentions. It's something you do. The same holds true with other truths, too. Seeing this, you can work on perfecting the skill appropriate for each activity. The skill with regard to stress is to comprehend it to the point where you have no more passion, aversion, or delusion toward doing it. To perfect this skill, you also have to abandon the cause of stress, to realize its cessation, and to develop the path to its cessation. Each of these skills assists the others. For example, when states of concentration arise in the mind, you don't just watch them arise and pass away. Concentration is part of the path, so the appropriate skill is to try to develop it, to understand what will make it grow steadier, subtler, more solid. In doing this, you develop the other factors of the path as well, until the doing of your concentration is more like simply being a luminous awareness, being present, being nothing, being one with emptiness. From that perspective, you begin to comprehend levels of stress you never noticed before. As you abandon the cravings causing the grosser levels, you become sensitive to subtler ones, so you can abandon them too. In doing this, your ignorance gets peeled away, layer by layer. You see more and more clearly why you've suffered from stress. You didn't grasp the connection between the cravings you enjoyed and the stress that burdened you, and didn't detect the stress in the activities you enjoyed. Ultimately, when you've abandoned the causes for other forms of stress, you begin to see that the being of your concentration contains many layers of doing as well, more layers of stress. That's when you can abandon any craving for these activities and full awakening occurs. The path to this awakening is necessarily gradual, both because the sensitivity it requires takes time to develop, and because it involves developing skills that you abandon only when they've done their job. If you abandon craving for concentration before developing it, you'd never get the mind into a position where it could genuinely and fully let go of the subtlest forms of doing. But as your skills converge, the awakening they foster is sudden. The Buddha's image is of the continental shelf off the coast of India, a gradual slope, followed by a sudden drop-off. After the drop-off, no trace of mental stress remains. That's when you know you've mastered your skills. And that's when you really know the Four Noble Truths. Craving, for instance, is something you experience every day, but until you totally abandon it, you don't really know it. You can experience stress for years on end, but you don't really know stress until you've comprehended it to the point where passion, aversion, and delusion are gone. And even though all four skills, as you're developing them, bring a greater sense of awareness and ease, you don't really know why they're so important until you've tasted where their full mastery can lead. For even full knowledge of the Four Noble Truths is not an end in and of itself. It's a means to something much greater. Nibbana is found at the end of stress, but it's much more than that. It's total liberation from all constraints of time or place, existence or non-existence, beyond all activity, even the activity of the cessation of stress. As the Buddha once said, the knowledge he gained in awakening was like all the leaves in the forest. The knowledge he imparted about the Four Noble Truths was like a handful of leaves. He restricted himself to teaching the handful because that's all he needed to lead his students to their own knowledge of the whole forest. If he were to discuss other aspects of his awakening, it would have served no purpose and actually gotten in the way. So even though full knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, to use another analogy, is just the raft across the river, you need to focus full attention on the raft while you're making your way across. Not only does this knowledge get you to full awakening, but it also helps you judge any realizations along the way. It does this in two ways. First, it provides a standard for judging those realizations. Is there any stress remaining in the mind? At all. If there is, then they're not genuine awakening. Second, the skills you've developed have sensitized you to all the doings in simply being, which ensures that the subtlest levels of ignorance and stress won't escape your gaze. Without this sensitivity, you could easily mistake an infinitely luminous state of concentration for something more. The luminosity would blind you. But when you really know what you're doing, you'll recognize freedom from doing when you finally encounter it. And when you know that freedom, you'll know something further, that the greatest gift you can give to others is to teach them the skills to encounter it for themselves. The causes of ignorance. As the Buddha notes in 1061, it's impossible to trace back into the past to find a point in time when ignorance began. But it is possible to look into the present moment to see what mental qualities sustain it. There we discover how desire and passion play their beginning role in the processes leading to suffering. The canon contains two lists of factors that sustain ignorance. The first list is composed of what are called the 5 hindrances: sensual desire, ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and anxiety, and doubt. Of these hindrances, sensual desire and ill will are the strongest, and also the two most clearly related to desire and passion. Sensual desire is a passion for sensual plans and fantasies. Ill will is the desire to see someone suffer, either yourself or somebody else. When the mind is obstructed by these two hindrances, it can't see clearly what's in its own best interest and what's not. For this reason, these hindrances can keep you from wanting to know that you're actually causing yourself to suffer by engaging in them, as you're more focused on other goals. Even if you know the Four Noble Truths and their duties, you don't really pay attention to them because you don't believe them. Your defilements tell you that you're incapable of understanding them, or you don't care what the truths say. You have other agendas. A similar principle applies to the second list of factors that sustain ignorance. These are the three effluents. The Pali word for effluent here, asava, literally means flowing out. Idiomatically, it's also applied to wine. Fruit wine is fruit asava. So the implications of the term are that these effluents are qualities that flow out of the mind and keep it intoxicated. The three effluents are sensuality, becoming, and ignorance. Here again, ignorance can be caused by misinformation or misunderstanding. You don't know, for example, what causes suffering, or you have wrong ideas about how it's caused. Or ignorance can be willed. You simply don't want to know what the Buddha says about suffering and its causes because you have other desires for sensuality or becoming that get in the way. These effluents lie deeper in the mind than the hindrances. The preliminary levels of awakening can eliminate the hindrances, but only full awakening can eradicate the effluents. The hindrances are simply obstacles to concentration. The effluents are the motor forces that sustain all the steps in the sequence of dependent co-arising through repeated rebirths, in spite of the suffering it causes, all because of the desire and passion to have the pleasures of sensuality, or the desire simply to be a being in a world where passions can be followed and pleasures found. The canon notes that these effluents that sustain ignorance are in turn sustained by ignorance. Darkness leading to darkness, not knowing and not wanting to know, feeding on each other in repeated feedback loops. It's only when you sense that you've suffered enough that you look for a light in the darkness. This may be why, when people who were receptive to the Buddha's message when they first heard it, compared his teaching to the act of bringing a lamp into the dark, so that those with eyes could see the objects that otherwise had been obscured. So the first spot in dependent co-arising where desire and passion play a role is prior to ignorance. In this sense, they underlie the whole process leading to suffering. This is why the Buddha equates the subduing of desire and passion with the unfettered freedom of release. Right next to ignorance. The Buddha traces the causes of suffering back to ignorance. The formal definition is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, but you can hear the Four Noble Truths, learn about them, memorize them, and still be ignorant. The definition could be translated in another way. We don't see things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. That's getting closer. In other words, knowledge means that you look at your experience, what's coming in through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And you see it in terms of where there's stress, what's causing the stress, what the cessation of stress would be, and how you would practice in order to bring about that cessation. That's asking you take on a framework that you don't normally take. The normal framework is me in the world, encountering things I like and don't like, suffering from the things I don't like. That's the way we tend to think about the issue. The Buddha's asking us to look at it in a different way. With each of those ways of looking, he says there's a duty. When you see that something is stressful, you try to comprehend it. In other words, you watch it and try to understand it to the point where you gain dispassion for it, because as he defines the nature of suffering, it's clinging, which is something you do. You're not simply a passive victim of suffering, you're actively doing it. Things you cling to, things that you hold dearly. Those are precisely the things you suffer from, so you've got to develop some dispassion for them. Otherwise, there's no getting away from suffering. As for the cause, craving, you want to abandon it. Craving for sensuality, in other words, enjoying sensual fantasies. Craving for becoming, wanting to take on an identity in this world so that you can get pleasures out of the world. And then craving for non-becoming. You find that your identity is not working well, so you want to destroy it. All those kinds of craving are to be abandoned. The cessation is to be realized, and the cessation is defined basically as the abandoning of craving. So there are two layers right there. You abandon craving, and then you watch, observe, and realize that when you let go of the craving, suffering really does stop. We develop the path so that we can put the mind in a position where it can see that happening. This is why we concentrate, taking the Buddha's definition of right mindfulness as our frame of reference. In other words, you're going to stay with the body right here, in and of itself. You're not going to think about the body in the world, either your imaginary worlds or in the actual human world. You focus on, this is what it's like to have a body right here. One of the ways you can do that is by focusing on the breath, simply watching it as a process on its own. As you do, you're going to see how it's connected with other events in the body and other events in the mind. But that's what you want to see. It's a process, because it's in understanding the process that you're going to be able to detect ignorance. But ignorance is elusive. It's like trying to turn a light on darkness. You turn a light on darkness, and it's not darkness anymore. You want to see ignorance in action. As Ajahn Suwat pointed out one time, if you're going to see ignorance in action, you have to look right next to it. Now, the Buddha talks about different ways of understanding how ignorance is caused, and how it functions in causing other things. So you want to look at the causal factors right before it and right after it. The primary explanation of the causal chain, of course, is in dependent co-arising, where he talks about how ignorance conditions fabrication. So what have we got? Right next to ignorance, you've got the breath. That's bodily fabrication. You've got directed thought and evaluation. That's verbal fabrication. And then you've got feelings and perceptions, mental fabrication. This is one of the reasons why we focus on the breath, thinking about the processes of how the breath is fabricated, and thinking about directed thought and evaluation and the perceptions we bring to the breath, because our ignorance is right next to these things. It's conditioning these things. You might say the path is one of really getting to know these processes really well. In the beginning, you're working, not with knowledge. You're working on a conviction that this is going to be a good place to look. You get used to staying here because ignorance is not going to show itself quickly. So you've got to be patient. You can't say, well, I don't like doing this. My mind doesn't settle down very easily. You've got to look at the problem where it's happening. It's like that old joke about the man traveling from one island to another in the Philippines. I learned this from my Filipino foster family when I was an exchange student there. This guy's keys fell off the side of the boat, so they asked him, "Why don't you jump down in the water and find the keys?" He said, "I want to wait till we get to the port." Why's that? Because the light is better there. You look where you lost the keys. You don't look where you think you'd rather look. You're ignorant here, so you've got to watch right here. Watch your breath. The mind resists. You keep coming back. If the mind resists for a long time, you might have to find another way of getting the mind to settle down. The Buddha talks about there being a fever in the body or a fever in the mind, which means you're getting antsy and you don't want to settle down right here. Well, you find another topic. Find something you find inspiring. You might think about the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. Think about your generosity. Think about your virtue. In times like this, you want to think about how good it has been, the times when you actually were able to carry through with the precepts when it was difficult, or you were able to be generous when it was difficult, to give you a sense of well-being. But eventually, you do want to get back to the breath, because that's right next to where ignorance is. The way you ordinarily direct your thoughts and evaluate things, in other words, the way you talk to yourself, is right next to ignorance too. A lot of times there are conversations in the mind. You find they operate on many levels. This is one of the things you're going to discover as you get the mind to settle down. You peel away one level of conversation and you find, oh, there's another one. There's a conversation and then there's somebody commenting on it. And often there's a commentator on the commentator. You get really still so that you can see these things to see what are the various levels talking about. You want to peel these levels away until you get to one that's just basically asking the question, what to do next? What to do next? What to do next? It's a question. At the very basis of our experience of time and place, there's a question. You can see that and you ask yourself, well, who's talking to whom in here? That's when you're getting really close to ignorance. Of course, there are also your perceptions, the labels you place on things, and your feelings. One of the reasons why so much attention is given to understanding feelings of pain is because a lot of your inner conversation and your inner perceptions are going to hover around pain, which means that there's going to be ignorance hovering around them too. This is one of the reasons why we focus right here, because all these things are right here, and they're right next to ignorance. As you get the mind to settle down, you find some of these layers of fabrication will peel away. The directed thought and evaluation peel away after a while, and you're just with one perception of the breath coming in, going out, minimal conversation. But that requires a strong perception. As you protect the feelings, the feeling tones, the feelings of pleasure and rapture, then the pleasure gets stronger, the rapture gets stronger, then it gets too much. You try to tune into a subtler level of pleasure and the rapture begins to evaporate. It's worth noting that the levels of jhana are defined by their feeling tone. As I mentioned the other day, the Buddha doesn't say, first jhana accompanied by pleasure and rapture. He just says, first jhana, pleasure and rapture accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. You're with the feeling tone. But again, you have to stay primarily with the breath. You have to stay with the frame of reference. Otherwise, the feeling tone will take over and you'll zone out. But you've got the feeling right here. You can look right here at the feeling, how you respond to the feeling of pleasure. When it seems to be too gross, even the pleasure gets too gross, then there's a feeling of equanimity. How do you understand that? The Buddha says you want to watch right there. Some people say, this is it. Everything's very still, very quiet. They talk about returning to your pure nature of knowing, but that's not what it is. It's just equanimity, and you can get fixated on the equanimity. But again, ignorance is right there, right nearby. So this is one of the ways you get close to ignorance so that you can see it. There's that other analysis, which is that ignorance is kept going by the hindrances, which means that if you understand the processes by which the mind gets distracted, the steps by which it changes from being focused on the breath to being focused on, say, a desire for a certain food, or a desire to see justice done here or there, to see people punished, whatever the hindrance, what are the steps between being focused here and moving? There tends to be a lot of ignorance in there as well. This is why you want to be as alert as possible to when the mind slips off, so that you can catch it. You begin to see stages in the process of moving that you didn't see before. That's another way of clearing up ignorance. There's also a passage where the Buddha talks about how ignorance is fed by the three asavas, or outflows, effluents of the mind: sensual desire, becoming, and ignorance itself. How does sensual desire flow out of the mind? It's not the case that something beautiful has to come, and then you feel desire for it, or a thought of something beautiful has to come, and then you feel a desire for it. Sometimes the desire is there before you have anything specific to latch onto. That desire is going to look for something to latch onto. Can you see that happen? This current that the ajahns talk about so much, the current of the mind flowing out, can you watch it flow but without your going with it, either to latch on to a particular pleasure or to latch on to a thought world in which you might take on an identity? So as you notice, the things you need to look at in order to see ignorance are all right here as you're focused on the breath and thinking in terms of fabrication. Thinking in terms of how to keep the mind from going with the hindrances, or thinking in terms of how to watch the mind as it flows out. It's like being a hunter. You know that the animals tend to go to a certain place, so you go to that place and hang out. You're very quiet and very watchful because you can't time when they're going to come. You can't say, I'm going to be hungry at 4 o'clock, so I want something to come by here by 3 so that I can have it in time for when I'm hungry. I talked with an anthropologist one time. He was talking about how in more modern anthropology, when you're going to go study a primitive tribe, you try to learn all the skills that the people in the tribe practice so that you really understand the life of the tribe from within. And he was saying that there's one skill that educated Westerners really have trouble mastering. In fact, they can't master it at all. That's the old ways of hunting. We weren't talking about modern ways of hunting where everything's tipped in favor of the person with lots of gear. The old kind of hunting, when you had to just be very quiet, very still, but very alert at the same time. That was the problem. It's mastering that mind state that's quiet and alert, and very, very patient that modern people have trouble mastering. But even though it may be hard to develop, that's what we've got to develop because, as I said, ignorance will show itself at these places, but it's never going to tell you when. We're all too eager, usually, to fill in the blanks, thinking we know when we really don't, thinking we understand when we don't. It requires a certain humility, the admission that, yeah, I really don't know. If you don't admit that you don't know, you won't even have in your mind the possibility that what you think you know could actually be ignorance. But that's precisely what it is. The same way that the things you think will give you happiness, the things you like, are precisely the things that are causing you to suffer. The Four Noble Truths are not intuitive. They make sense on paper, but when you actually look at how the mind works, they go against a lot of our habits. It's in learning how to develop new habits that we can actually see things in terms of the noble truths and carry through with their duties. So it's always important that you bring to the practice the attitude that you're willing to learn. Or as Ajahn Suwat would say, you've been acting in stupid ways and now you recognize your stupidity. You're not going to recognize the total depth of your stupidity until you're done with ignorance, which is one of the reasons why, when people really do gain awakening, there's no pride. It's the realization of something you should have known but you kept ignoring. But when you finally do know it, that's when there's the end of suffering, and that's all that matters at that point. Ajahn Suwat said when you find the ultimate happiness that comes with that, you don't care about whether there's somebody there or not somebody there, whether there's a self there or no self there to experience it. The happiness is sufficient in and of itself. Questions of self and not self don't matter. Or, as Ajahn Mahabua would say, if you take ideas of self and not self and try to plaster them on nibbana, it's as if you're covering it with excrement. But when you find it, it's pure. That's what they say, so check and see for yourself.